Welcome to this week's rant. This week's rant is called Have You Been Screwed by Catalina? All will become clear in a few minutes. First, normal parish notices. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, why not? Go subscribe. Please subscribe to the channel. The subscribe icon is down there. If you want to be notified when this sort of content and other content hits the channel, it's the bell icon is the one you want to be hitting. Consider becoming a member of the TG community and support the creation of videos and the purchase of equipment to do up. The Patreon address is down there. Also down there are the Instagram and Facebook tags. Go tag me on one of those platforms because that's where all the other notices for the channel arrive, including the competition. Or should I say more correctly, the giveaway. Anyway, back to the main video. Back in January 2020, I did a video, which I thought was quite innocent at the time, about upgrading your Macintosh, or your Apple Mac, or your MacBook Pro, or whatever you want to call it these days, to Catalina. And I kind of sort of said at that point in time, in that video, that if you had specific equipment, and at that point in time it was specifically Roland, you had to go and do a driver upgrade because Roland's drivers would not support Catalina. And when I did that video, really I wasn't thinking any further than the fact that I had a whole bunch of boutique equipment that had been supplied by Roland and I had to go and do driver upgrades on pretty much every piece of it. That video has been seen by so many people, and I've had so many comments about this, that I thought, here we are, better part of 9 months later, and more issues with Catalina are crawling out of the woodwork, hence the reason why this video is called Have You Been Screwed by Catalina? So the problem is that Apple, who actually, to be fair to Apple, have for a number of years now said that they will be withdrawing support for 32-bit drivers. Now, for those of you who don't understand the whole concept of the 32 and 64-bit drivers, effectively, it's the way the computer works. And we started off back in the 80s with effectively 8-bit processors. My Sinclair ZX Spectrum, I think, was an 8-bit processor. And what that meant is it could process 8 pieces of information at any point in time. I'm not going to get into the technicals of this. Over the years, we've gone from 8 to 64, and going from 8 to 64 is not a doubling, it's a quadrupling. Okay, it goes up by a factor. Then we went from 16 to 32, and we've been sort of kind of in the 32-bit land for quite a long time. And then probably for the last 10 years or so, manufacturers have been issuing operating systems that worked on 64-bit architectures, i.e. 64 bits of information are processed on each instruction. In order to support a lot of legacy applications, the manufacturers have effectively left in their code base 32-bit support, which basically means that they have some sort of interpreter running that allows them to run 32-bit instruction sets against a 64-bit operating architecture. Most computers have, probably for the last 10 years, been 64-bit enabled, but effectively the operating system dumbs them down. So for years you could install Microsoft Windows. You can't anymore, but you used to be able to install Microsoft Windows in a 32-bit format and a 64-bit format. And it was kind of up to you which format you wanted to choose. Now, you tended to go to 64, and they kept the 32-bit support in the operating system. Apple have done exactly the same thing. So for the past X number of years, they've actually been running a 64-bit operating system on their machines, but they've left in their operating system all the support for 32-bit applications, drivers, etc. With the advent of Catalina, what Apple have done is completely drop support for 32-bit. They've removed all the code that sits in their operating system supporting 32-bit applications and drivers, and their operating system is now a pure 64-bit operating system. What does this mean? It means that if you have any piece of equipment where you have to load an app or a driver onto your Apple Mac to make it work or to make it function properly, and that Apple driver is not 64-bit, has not been effectively compiled against a 64-bit, a true 64-bit operating system, the likelihood is it's not going to work because it is trying to do something that the computer won't let it do. And that is kind of where the problem is now landing. I will go over the comments that have been, I'm not going to do it on a comment by comment, but it's not just Roland, although Roland have the predominant number of comments against that video I did in January. Other manufacturers do have comments there as well, but I'm being fair and saying the majority of them are against Roland, but there are other manufacturers. So if you've bought a piece of equipment and that piece of equipment requires a USB connection to your computer to make something work, if that USB connection is not class compliant. Now, what I mean by class compliant is if your device is class compliant, when you plug the machine into the device into your computer, effectively they do a handshake. The device sends details down the USB to say, I'm a thing, and this is how you talk to me. And the computer says, I understand how to talk to you, and effectively installs the bits it needs to make that connection happen. That's kind of class compliant dumbed down. Okay, if the device is not class compliant, then you need to tell the computer how to talk to the device. And until you tell the computer how to talk to the device, even though you've plugged it in, it may see the device, but it doesn't know how to communicate. It doesn't know what it's meant to be doing. And a lot of musical instruments over the last few years have sort of kind of played on this USB arrangement where, you know, you can take an audio feed directly out of your, I don't know, I'm going to use a Roland device just for the sheer hell of it because it's easier, your TR8, okay? You can take an audio feed out of your TR8 and via USB and plug it into your computer, and it will present 16 channels of audio. Now, I may have got that wrong, so don't shout at me because I'm trying to do this from memory. But it will present, let's say, 16 channels of audio. The kick drums, the snare drums, the toms, the hi-hats, etc. But all those will be presented down the channel, it's not actually, I can't remember, it's not 16. Anyway, that's how it works. And to make that work, you had to install a driver on your computer. Whether it be Windows or Apple, both needed a driver. You install the driver, the computer recognizes the device, presents the audio, and presents the MIDI down the USB as well. That's how it worked. Now, other devices, say for example a Focusrite Scarlett, which is an input-output device, will present audio inputs, depending on how many there are. So if you had a 12i device, then that would present 12 channels of audio to your computer for recording purposes, and it also present 6 channels of audio out, for argument's sake. And I've used that extensively in my studio. Admittedly, the Focusrite is in storage at the moment. I'm sort of kind of wondering whether actually it's going to work for me because it is quite an old device. But the principle is the same. You still had to install a driver. The driver had to work on the Apple Mac. And assuming everything was right, you would get your 12 channels of audio presented that you could then attach to channels in your DAW and record whatever it was you were trying to record. So that's the basic principle of where the issue is coming from. Right? Computer, 64-bit, device needs to be installed to make your driver needs to be installed to make your device be recognized on the computer. Great. Now, the issue that a lot of you are seeing is you have bought equipment in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. And because you've bought that equipment in the last 10 to 15 years, in order for that equipment to run properly, you need to plug it into the USB of your computer. Roland have now stopped supporting that equipment. It's now discontinued on the Roland line or a number of other manufacturers' production lines. They no longer support it. And because of that, Roland and the other manufacturers, and I am using Roland because a majority of the comments are Roland related, have stopped supporting the equipment, and they're no longer updating the drivers. Therefore, if the drivers have not been written purely as a 64-bit driver, and many of them haven't, when you update to Catalina, guess what, guys? It is not working. That is the issue. And a lot of musicians out there feel they have been screwed by the whole Catalina thing. And it is starting to worry people. Now, I've said on the channel before, as you know, I love my legacy synthesizers. I have quite a few of them. And the thing about legacy synthesizers is they talk MIDI, okay? And you need a MIDI interface to make that work. Honestly, if my MIDI interface didn't have a 64-bit driver, for the sake of 30 or 40 pounds, I'd go and buy another one. It wouldn't bother me too much. However, if you have a studio that's predominantly set up running USB and not MIDI, then every single one of those devices that hasn't got a driver update or is not class compliant effectively will now stop working. Which means you can't upgrade to Catalina, because if you do upgrade to Catalina, your studio stops working. And that is causing a lot of people a lot of concern, because it now means they are locked into an operating system they can't upgrade. They can't go and buy effectively a new computer. Now, Windows 10 at the moment still works, but I suspect Microsoft at some point are going to also pull the plug on 32-bit as well. But at some point, you're kind of locked into a period. Now, I do know people who've still got, the old Mac G4s, massive great things, and they won't upgrade those because they work and they do exactly what they want it to do. But the problem they have is they're now kind of running out of storage with sort of high fidelity, because the disks that you put inside these are now starting to become short supply. So that's a concern to them, but they won't upgrade it because it all works. And if you're operating, I don't know, something like a Mac on Mojave or High Sierra, which I think is 1013 and 1014, I can never remember the code words. But if you're operating a Mac on one of those platforms and you're sitting there thinking, well, my Mac is now X number of years old. I mean, I'll be honest with you, my Mac is now 6 years old. The one I currently use for editing these videos and my music production. And I am seriously thinking that now is probably the time to start thinking about upgrading my Mac to a newer version. But I'm also in the same boat, that do I upgrade? Then on the flip side, I've already got Catalina on mine, so I've already completely screwed my upgrade path anyway. So for me, the decision is kind of made. I will probably buy a new Mac within the next 12 months. Just then, as you all know, buying a new Mac is not a cheap exercise. But the point is that if you are on Catalina, a lot of this equipment is not going to work. You are effectively kind of screwed. The other thing that's become apparent is that if you buy a new MacBook Pro now, it will come pre-installed with Catalina. Okay, you can't go backwards. So you can't install Mojave or High Sierra. You can't install those two operating systems because it won't let you. Probably because most of the drivers that are on your brand new Mac don't exist in those previous platforms. So that's the reason why you can't go backwards. So the question is, what do we as a community do? We've got these big corporations, they've made these decisions, they're no longer supporting these pieces of equipment, they're no longer going to update the drivers to pure 64-bit drivers. What do we do? The answer is not a lot individually. However, what I've been saying to people who've been leaving comments on the channel is raise a ticket with the company. If enough of you raise a ticket with these companies, then maybe they will change their stance when they realise just how unhappy you guys are that you've invested in their technology and now have been effectively left high and dry by this situation. I don't think the whole USB interface scenario has been really thought through for the long term. If the equipment requires USB to work, then you need to have a period of time in which it should work. And I would say, I mean, I look at my legacy synthesizers, and yes, some of them are broken. I've got one sitting here that is due to go back on the bench because it's broken. But in general terms, these things are 30, well, that one is definitely 30 something years old. Okay. And when I fix it, it will work again. But some of my other synthesizers are definitely 30 plus years old. They work beautifully, but they have no USB interface. And are we getting into a throwaway society where I spend £200 or £300 on an instrument, in some cases more? Some of these high-end stuff, you could be spending several £1,000s on that particular instrument that is being sold on the whole sort of USB connectivity, direct into DAW, being able to edit patches on your computer and throw them down to the instrument. You get the drift. If we band together as a community and tell the manufacturers we are not happy, maybe the manufacturers will spend, a few £1,000s, and it's not going to cost them a great deal of money. It's probably, in terms of goodwill, it's probably going to cost them 50 grand to go across their entire product range and issue drivers that will work on Catalina and Windows 10, and get them to make the commitment they will support the drivers. Don't need the equipment support. If your equipment goes wrong, fair enough. But to be honest, if the equipment depends on the USB to make it work, if you can't use the USB, then you've effectively got a dead duck, especially for input-output devices. So for input-output devices, you really have a problem because that won't work. You've got to go and buy a new input-output device. And for a struggling, home setup musician, another 300 or 400, maybe even more if you've got a high-endish device. It's quite a heavy outlay, especially where we are now in COVID-19, and many musicians are, the live work has basically all but dried up. So to find out that now half their music studio doesn't work as well, that's actually quite painful. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say on Catalina. If you've been screwed, raise a ticket with the manufacturer. Let's get a swell of movement saying that we're not happy about this situation, and maybe they will change their stance. Now, before I go, I did a thing a few weeks ago where I talked about lights. So this is one of my lights, okay? And it's the first time I've ever seen smoke come out of the back of this thing. It was rancid. The smell of electrical bits when they burn. Well, that's what I had on this. I am going to take it to pieces. I might do a video taking it to pieces just so you can see what's inside this. I'm actually quite intrigued to see what's inside it. But this is a video and a flashlight. So effectively, the bit in the middle is the light, and then the ring around the edge is a flash. And I've been using these with my camera for years, so I'm not quite surprised it's sort of gone bang. But it served me fairly well. It wasn't particularly expensive. It was fairly cheap. So that's gone wrong. And the other thing I'm just going to bring you up to speed with is I started some retrobrighting several weeks back, and it has been a bit of a journey, to be honest, but there you go. So that end there, that end is the control end effectively in the insides, and if you look at that now, it's not far off. You can't really see it on camera, but there is a bit of blotching down here. But other than that, I think that's come out pretty well, so I'll put that back together. Back into the SideQuest drive, and that concludes the first retrobrighting experiment, and I'll go through on that experiment how I've changed the setup and how I think things needed to happen. Other than that, live long and prosper. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.